The wreckage of a vast facility in Chile, once a beacon of development.
The workers are put up on a pedestal. They became heroes in the community. Clearly, at some stage, something happened here that changed that dramatically.
A Maltese ruin, the one-time refuge for a modern icon.
You'd never guess who once lived here. She's probably the most famous woman in the world.
A sweeping complex on the outskirts of Havana that carried a revolutionary vision.
The message that he was trying to communicate is that Cuba had moved on from its history and was forging a new future.
And scattered remains in Germany, which stood at the heart of an evil empire.
What we see here is a deliberate attempt to be grandiose. This is designed to inspire awe. This is pompous architecture. This is power madness expressed in stone.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the back streets of Malta's capital, Valletta, lies a portal to a majestic world.
The buildings here all look pretty similar. They're the same color, and they blend into each other in these tightly packed streets.
But behind that door is something quite spectacular and rather unexpected.
It's like a palace lost in the streets of the city.
When you step inside, you can see this used to be a beautiful home.
It's bright and open and breezy. It has an air of decadence and indulgence about it.
Further investigation reveals a hidden garden.
The gardens are overgrown and the pillars are starting to crumble. There's a balcony outside that stretches out to open vistas.
There are these beautiful carved reliefs and these detailed sculptures just decorating every feature of the place. Every aspect of this space has been carefully thought through.
Who left behind these traces of decadence?
The way this place looks now, you'd never guess who once lived here.
This was once home to a powerful and influential couple who are famous the world over.
This is Villa Guanaja, largely built in 1900. Heritage expert Kenneth Gambin knows how grand this dilapidated place was during its heyday in the mid-20th century.
It was stunning, of very high standard, with expensive furniture, mostly of European origin, renowned paintings, rich curtains. The interior was quite luxurious. One would definitely have had to be a very important person to live here.
And the layout of the rooms reveals more about the people who once called this place home.
This used to be a very busy part of the property. This was the servants' quarters, so you can imagine the hustle and bustle of every day work going on here.
This was a place that was designed for entertaining and for status.
The strategic location of Malta is the first clue to this building's importance.
Malta is one of the most strategic chess pieces in history. It's got a maritime history that stretches back thousands of years, that's full of dynamic change.
The British, on the invitation of the Maltese, took over the island, and subsequently, in 1914, it was officially a British colony.
Malta was the premier overseas naval base for the British Empire. It was from here that they had a point of entry to the Middle East, to India, and beyond.
It had long been the headquarters of the British Navy's Mediterranean fleet. And by the Second World War, Malta had become a key base for the Allied powers.
Submarines were launched from here, aircraft, ships. This was the Allies' key base in the middle of an Axis-controlled sea.
The importance of the island didn't stop at the end of the war.
That naval foothold remained key.
And it's the British naval base that brought the Villa Guanaja's world-famous residents to the island's shores.
When you know who lived here, it really lets you imagine what an opportunity this place was for them. It allowed them something that they would only ever get a glimpse of during their entire lifetime. And that was privacy.
The Royal Naval Base drew none other than the newly wedded royal couple themselves, Elizabeth and Philip.
Their Royal Highnesses are staying with Vice Admiral Lord Mountbatten and Lady Mountbatten at their residence, the Villa Guanaja, and most attractive it looks.
When they arrived here in 1949, little did the royal couple know that duty would soon call Princess Elizabeth back to serve her country. For the time being, though, they could embrace life in this secluded home.
Elizabeth found a freedom here. She and Philip could enjoy an independence in Malta.
And Villa Guanaja allowed them to step away from the media spotlight.
Monarchy in the 20th century was becoming more public. The extremities of war drew the royal family out so that they were in touch with the ordinary people like never before.
Elizabeth and Philip married just after the war in 1947, when the country was still a wreck. People wanted a lift.
The young Elizabeth was warm-hearted, she was hardworking, understated, and extremely dignified. Philip was personable, relatable, handsome, had a great sense of humor, and he made her happy.
The couple had been bombarded by press photographers throughout their recent honeymoon, and they were determined that this trip abroad would be different.
There are very few photographs of Princess Elizabeth living in this property, and one of them was taken right there.
The rooms of this dilapidated ruin were unlike those of their grand palaces back home.
We are actually in what used to be the princess's bedroom, and this would have been the view she would have enjoyed during her stay here.
The most striking feature of this site is the walkway. It's not safe anymore, but you can imagine back in the time how you would have walked out of the first floor onto it and just been greeted by this extraordinary view.
The great and the good passed through this place.
So the couple would have entertained their guests in this room. This was the largest and most important room in the whole building.
It's where they threw private parties, and you can just imagine how liberating this must have been for Elizabeth. She'd grown up in the formal, protocol-heavy, stultifying atmosphere of the British royal palaces, and now she was free to have her own home, throw her own parties, have her own life.
The future queen could even go outside in private, in the now overgrown garden, concealed behind high walls.
The garden was a sanctuary, away from others, where Elizabeth's love for gardening could really take root and grow.
But Elizabeth couldn't hide forever, and eventually, duty called.
It was a sad turn of events that brought it all to a swift end. In September 1951, King George had surgery at Buckingham Palace to remove his left lung.
Someone had to take on the role that he could no longer fulfill. So Elizabeth increasingly assumed royal duties, and that meant that there was no more time for her in Malta.
Queen Elizabeth has been in the public eye ever since, steering her nation over its choppy course. Following her father's death, Elizabeth's coronation in 1953 was the first to be broadcast live around the world.
Queen Elizabeth has basically broken every record there is. She's the longest lived and longest reigning British monarch. Plus, she's probably the most famous woman in the world.
Malta achieved independence in 1964, and the Villa Guanaja would never be home for Queen Elizabeth II again.
If you look at her life as a whole, her time here was something really very special. It stands out. It was the one time when she and her husband were actually allowed to be themselves.
In the years following, the villa was left to rot under the ownership of a reclusive old lady who couldn't afford to maintain it. And although the Queen returned to Malta a number of times, in her later visits, it's alleged that the owner denied her access to this hideaway villa. This abandoned home is the only place outside of the UK that a British monarch has resided. And since the government of Malta took ownership in 2019, it's been keen to preserve it.
Malta obviously wants to restore the building. We want the visitors to experience how life was like to the princess way back then in 1950.
Looking at the condition this has fallen into, it's hard to believe that this was once a royal residence. But hopefully, someday soon, it might return to its former glory.
On the outskirts of the Cuban capital of Havana lies the shattered dream of two freedom fighters.
These buildings are so fantastical. Something really ignited someone's imagination and let it run free in these shapes and these designs.
There's hardly a right angle in the entire place.
Few clues as to the site's original purpose appear to have survived the ravages of time.
Clearly, nature's been allowed to sort of take over in a small way, but then there are some areas that they look like foundations. They've never been completed.
There's a sense of whatever stopped that process happening very abruptly.
So what happened to crush this romantic vision? These swirling structures were born out of political upheaval.
In the 1950s, Cuba had been under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. It was an incredibly corrupt country, and a small group of revolutionaries started a war against the government.
Led by Fidel Castro and his loyal lieutenant, Che Guevara. Their victory in 1961 may have divided opinion, but it broke the stranglehold of Batista's corrupt government and gave them control of places like Havana's golf club.
Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, they decide to go and play golf one day in the elite club, a place that they'd previously never been allowed anywhere near.
They start to talk to each other and say what a shame it is that this has been shut off from most of the Cuban people. They hatch a very ambitious plan to change this golf course into something else entirely.
The result was this: Cuba's National School of Art. Built in the 1960s, this series of ambitious structures was designed to nurture excellence in ballet, modern dance, visual arts, music, and drama. Local Jose Villa Soberon came to this otherworldly place to study sculpture.
Empecé a estudiar en el año 16 años. Era para un joven que quería estudiar arte, era como descubrir un mundo absolutamente nuevo.
You walk along the corridors, you lose sense of where you're coming from and where you're going, and that was intentional. The message is that Cuba had moved on from its history and was forging a new future.
But the idealistic campus, its vaulted structures reflecting the optimism of the time, soon began to look outdated. As Soviet influence in Cuba grew, a storm was brewing. It culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a nuclear standoff between the Soviet Union and the USA.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the country was forced to start prioritizing defense over other considerations. And suddenly, this grand project faced a cash flow problem.
Construction was soon stopped, and the school closed down before it was completed.
The builders are pulled off site, the architects are let go, and the schools are just left as they stand on that day.
Today, the school is experiencing a renaissance as international architects once again celebrate its unique and optimistic design.
The future does look optimistic for these buildings. They were so beautifully built in the first place, and although never finished, it looks finally like funding might be available from Europe to complete the job.
On the outskirts of Santiago, Chile, epic warehouse-style structures dominate the San Bernardo area.
The centerpiece of this neighborhood, what you can't miss, is this huge concrete building about 500 feet long.
If you think that's big, it used to be a lot bigger. This site was once so large that the original entrance was 1,000 feet away, right on the other side of the neighborhood.
An inscription above these main gates gives some indication of this site's original function.
Over the entrance, carved the words Maestranza, which in Latin America usually means machine shop or repair shop. If this was a machine shop, it was designed to handle something enormous.
Dappled light illuminates curious design features inside the complex.
Along the floor are these gigantic pits, big enough for a man to stand up in.
So these uniformly spaced pits in the floor would seem to be a place for workers to go to work on the underside of whatever it is they are assembling or repairing above them.
Once impressively engineered, this place has long been stripped bare. The fate of this compound is intimately connected to one man, an ambitious dictator, and his chilling legacy. The ongoing mystery of Chile's so-called disappeared. Derek Hyland is passionate about the machines that once rolled through here. And a circular structure outside provides the first clue to what they were.
A turntable is like a bridge which is pivoted at its center and would allow an engine to come in and be turned in any direction. In this case, it will be turned so it can be placed into the main workshop.
The design of this complex revolved around one thing: trains.
This place in particular is the mecca of the railways for this country. And this transformed the life of this town. This is basically was the heart of this town.
This is Maestranza de San Bernardo, once the second largest train workshop in South America.
This is the roundhouse. It has 11 stalls where they would store the locomotives once they were repaired. The engine would come in here, we'd have little steps before, so you could actually get under the engine. Basically very similar to an inspection pit for a car.
The need for a facility of this kind came with the rapid development of the country's rail network in the late 19th century.
Chile's a long, narrow, thinly populated country, so harnessing railroads was key to connecting its far-flung regions. And you've got the Atacama Desert in the far north, and you've got Patagonia in the far south, Santiago right in the middle, and so the rails are a perfect way to connect up this big landmass.
Construction began in 1916. 8 pavilions sprawled across 111 acres with additional buildings and maneuvering yards. The country's industrialization went hand in hand with its railway development, and the Maestranza would become its beating heart.
You can't overstate the importance of the Maestranza to the town of San Bernardo. Without the Maestranza, there would be no San Bernardo. The town was built around it, and almost every household had at least one person working in the Maestranza. The scale was extraordinary. The locomotives would come in by rail. They would be lifted up by vast cranes fixed to the ceiling and then put down into the relevant area of the workshop, where they could be investigated, dismantled, repaired, and then sent out again on the rails.
The shop was set up initially for repairing trains, but over time, they began to design and build their own steam locomotives.
Instead of importing railway wagons and locomotives, Chile would build them itself, and so it would develop engineering capability, manufacturing capability.
Maestranza was designed to service approximately 500 engines a year. That's nearly 10 engines a week. In its heyday, there were about 1,200 people working here. In the 1930s, 1940s, this place would be bustling with activity, with new engines, probably in some stalls, with repaired engines in other, coming in and out.
And it was skilled work. You needed a workforce that really knew how to handle this machinery.
These were not only blue-collar workers, but these were local heroes. These were men who were earning good wages, learning skilled positions, expanding the Chilean economy. This was really a kind of engine of Chilean growth at the time.
The Maestranza workers were proud to form a union, but later in the century, that would be their undoing. Seismic change was coming to Chile, and the Maestranza would find itself in the firing line.
In 1973, the Chilean people elect Salvador Allende, a socialist, to be president of Chile. And there's great resistance inside the highly conservative Chilean armed forces, commanded by General Augusto Pinochet.
General Pinochet instigated a violent coup against Allende. And despite planning to overthrow a democratically elected government, Pinochet had outside help from the United States.
The Nixon administration and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger look at the rise of Allende as dangerous as the rise of Castro in Cuba. And so they give the green light to Pinochet to move against Allende, and they oust Allende.
Pinochet attacked the presidential palace, and Salvador Allende killed himself to escape capture.
Coming from the political right, Pinochet was ideologically opposed to socialism and its ideas of large state-run enterprises.
And you couldn't get a government-run scheme much bigger or more expensive than the national rail network.
In the days after the coup, there was confusion and fear. Nobody really knew what to expect of this new dictatorship, but workers still had to earn money and make a living, so they continued to go to work at the Maestranza.
Thousands of people, especially union members, were accused of communist leanings and began disappearing from workplaces up and down the country. And Pinochet soon turned his attention to the Maestranza.
You had all of these skilled workers, all of them unionized, all of them left-leaning in their politics. So he sees the Maestranza and the city that's grown up around it, the company town, as being a hotbed of communist and socialist activity.
On the 28th of September 1973, Pinochet's men arrived.
12 members of the Maestranza were taken away by the military and shot. The community was in shock when they heard about this news.
The 6 men, in reality, weren't in any way a threat to Pinochet. They had communist leanings, but they weren't terrorists. They were simply idealists who were used to being able to debate and discuss in a democratic country. But under Pinochet, that was over.
Across Chile, more than 1,000 others would disappear during Pinochet's reign of terror. The Maestranza itself continued to operate, but it finally closed in 1984.
But when Pinochet was able to point to the fact that it was making a loss, that was enough for him to pull all of the funding, and that sparked the beginning of the end for the Maestranza.
The dictator's reign of terror lasted until 1990, but he was never punished for human rights violations against more than 30,000 people. Thanks to enthusiasts like Derek, this complex survives as a lasting memorial to Chile's once booming rail industry and those who lost their lives at the hands of Pinochet.
On the 6th of October every year, the Railways Workers' Day is commemorated in remembrance of these 12 workers that were killed here. I feel deeply motivated and proud of what we achieved.
Yet many people in Chile are still seeking closure from this terrible time. To this day, around 1,000 souls are still officially listed as missing. In Philadelphia, USA, is a sprawling complex that once housed America's most wanted. Surrounded by high stone walls, this foreboding place is undoubtedly a prison. From above, its design looks innovative, but the interior is anything but. Yet the cell of one disreputable inmate is almost luxurious.
At least one of the cells we know of was in a place called Park Avenue, so that gives you the idea that he had more of a celebrity treatment here.
So, which infamous villain, nicknamed Scarface, ended up here? Sarah Jane Elk is president of this once imposing building.
Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829, and it was an experiment in reform.
At the time, Eastern State Penitentiary was the most famous and expensive prison in the world. Hundreds of jails copied its pioneering wagon wheel design.
It meant that a small group of guards could keep an eye on the whole prison from that one location. The idea was, we're not just going to punish prisoners, we're going to allow them time to reflect and repent. The word penitentiary comes from repent. So they isolated each prisoner by himself in a cell. They didn't get to talk to each other. They were supposed to spend their days in quiet contemplation of their crimes.
But as inmate numbers grew, cells meant for one soon housed 2 or 3. And even the advanced design features failed to work as originally intended.
There were furnaces at the end of the cell blocks, and they were to heat the tunnels underneath the cells, and then the air was to flow in. But the people closest to the furnaces were getting carbon monoxide sickness, and the people on the other ends were getting frostbite.
By the end of the century, the notion of reflective solitary confinement was replaced with overcrowding and harsh, unsanitary conditions. Although in 1929, an exception was made for one of the most notorious criminals of all time.
When Al Capone came here, he was already a famous man. He was brought here from the county prison for his protection.
Capone lived a life of luxury compared to the other inmates and described his time inside this elaborately furnished cell as easy. In March 1930, he walked out of the penitentiary's gates as a free man, only to be jailed again a year later. And this once revolutionary prison closed due to overcrowding in 1971. Today, the Eastern State Penitentiary is a National Historic Landmark and museum, which includes a tour of Al Capone's cell. In the German city of Nuremberg is a vast, overgrown site that appears to have been built by different empires.
There's this enormous white marble structure that when you look at it has the lines and proportions of an altar from ancient Greece.
And yet you're like, why is the Pergamon altar here in a German provincial town?
Another seemingly ancient relic is even more confounding.
It looks like a great amphitheater, almost like the Roman Colosseum.
These relics all seem to come from very different eras, so it's really not clear what links them all together.
Elsewhere around the town, scattered ruins start to paint an ominous picture. A single stone block beside an extensive man-made lake. A subterranean room with a gold-covered ceiling. And a monumental road carving a line between them all.
It's only when you scratch beneath the surface that you see that none of this is what it seems. It's all a facade.
The extent of this complex hints at a monstrous abuse of power.
The man who built this did not think of himself as a villain. He thought of himself as the builder of a mighty empire. This is power madness expressed in stone.
These are the remains of the crazed vision of a leader dubbed the most evil man in history. But to do all this, he needed the help of a willing and ruthlessly ambitious collaborator. Local expert Alexander Schmidt studies the history of this macabre place.
You can see here a Colosseum in Germany. It was never finished, so there is no roof on it. It should be doubled as high as we can see it now.
This enormous amphitheater is over 800 foot long and over 120 foot high. It's covered in granite panels and was designed to look like something straight out of the Roman Empire.
But this is not the only epic-sized structure here. Covering an area bigger than 12 football pitches, this overgrown space is known as the Zeppelin Field.
In 1909, the German Graf Zeppelin, who invented these big dirigible airships, actually landed a Zeppelin here, which gives you a sense of just how big the field had to be.
The Zeppelin field now looks a little bit ruined, but you can see white stone here, and you have here, like in a football stadium, some tribunes for the visitors.
So what were these tribunes or grandstands built for? Nuremberg itself is the first clue to figuring out what this strange collection of ruins is all about.
Nuremberg was one of the great imperial cities, and it was the center of an ancient Germanic empire.
In the medieval era, this early Germanic empire was a political powerhouse which dominated Europe for centuries until its decline in the early 1800s. By the 1930s, its greatness was a distant memory. But a new, ambitious political movement sought to resurrect its power in the form of Hitler's Nazi Party.
Bavaria, where Nuremberg is, was the most Nazified place in Germany. So it was natural that Hitler would gravitate to this region to anchor the symbols of the Nazi regime.
Hitler seeks to build his ritual center here in Nuremberg. And all of these structures are designed for thousands of people to listen to one man speaking.
But Hitler did not design all of this alone. It was the work of his accomplice, the ambitious Nazi architect, Albert Speer.
Albert Speer, sniffed out early on Hitler's narcissism and megalomania, and he kind of tailored his architecture to suit Hitler's grandiose taste.
He is going to create a Nazi architecture that subordinates the will of the individual to the collective will of the German race expressed through der Führer Adolf Hitler.
Together, they mapped out this collection of structures known as the Nazi Party rally grounds, and the Zeppelin field lay at its heart.
This would be full of people, of visitors, who can see the big parades, the celebrations on the fields. On the fields are 100,000 or 200,000 uniformed men.
The rally grounds were designed to house some of the most chilling demonstrations of power in history.
The grotesque crowning glory of the Zeppelin field was this altar-like tribune.
This is the main tribune of the Zeppelin field. It's made of natural stone and especially from granite. This architecture should show how strong the German state, the Third Reich, was.
Beneath the grandstand, Speer designed an extraordinary golden room, which allowed Hitler to indulge his sinister delusions.
It's a hall over 20 feet high with the most spectacular golden designs on the ceiling. And the idea was for Hitler to rise up onto his rostrum as if out of thin air.
But Speer had only just started. He wanted his designs to provide a chilling setting for Nazi propaganda films, and he would stop at nothing to get it built.
Albert Speer, as an architect, is a man with no professional integrity whatsoever. Albert Speer knows what Hitler wants, and he's going to deliver it in every respect.
How can Speer get the material, the granite? And he has an idea. He made a cooperation with the SS, with Heinrich Himmler, and they are founding concentration camps nearby quarries, granite quarries. And it was the idea of Albert Speer himself.
Albert Speer uses concentration camp inmates. He works them to death.
But regardless of the terrible human cost, Hitler and Speer would not be stopped. At the perimeter of the rally grounds is a foundation stone sitting on the edge of a man-made lake. The only trace of what was going to be the site's jewel in the crown.
This is the place where the German stadium, the biggest stadium in the world, should be built, but it wasn't. You can see that. It's only the hole for the foundation now, full with water.
Speer's design was going to hold 400,000 people. It was going to be built of red and pink granite and over 400 feet high.
Had it been finished, it would have been the capstone to the Nuremberg rally grounds.
The Nuremberg rally grounds would have radiated out from this monstrous stadium. Covering 4 square miles, it included the vast Zeppelin field, its menacing grandstand, all linked together by the Great Road, which led to the Colosseum-style Congress Hall. But while the architecture here was monumental, the materials used to build it were anything but. Behind the solid stone facades was just brick and concrete.
The original construction was quick and shoddy. It was little more than a stage set, but designed to have the most dramatic effect.
Between 1933 and 1938, Hitler's supporters flocked to this site for a series of mass Nazi Party rallies. But with the outbreak of the Second World War, construction ceased, and Speer's chilling facade crumbled.
Hitler's empire was supposed to last 1,000 years, but the hasty methods used to create the illusion of mighty stadiums and gigantic pillars, they were an illusion, just like Hitler's Reich.
At the Nuremberg war crimes trials that followed the war, Hitler's sidekick Albert Speer presented himself as a good Nazi.
After the war, he said, "I'm only an architect, I'm an artist. I don't know anything about Auschwitz."
Speer gets off pretty lightly. He only gets 20 years in jail because of this image or reputation he had as the good Nazi who sort of reluctantly fell in with Hitler.
Today, the ruins of Albert Speer's ambition litter Nuremberg.
This is not a monument to Hitler's greatness or Nazi greatness. Because when you look at this, you can see what a pile of rubbish Nazi Germany really was.